Thanks for being with me on the show today, Matt. It's always an honor to have you here sharing your analysis and expertise.
Hey, Chris, it's great to see you. Great to be back. And we got a special episode lined up as well, I think. I'm actually looking forward. Today's content is going to be something a little new. I'm going to actually give a preview, Chris, and say that it is the 4th month. And that is a little bit of a hint of the thing we'll be talking about today, right?
We're bringing
Maybe number
numerology into it, right?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay. Today we're talking about some of the heavier parts that this whole cyber thing encompasses. We're going to be talking about Sandworm. This cyber unit is about as dangerous as you can get and has shown itself to be one of the most, if not the most, tightly integrated with kinetic military operations the world has ever seen. We've covered their actions on the show several times before in a few different ways. They've come up in the Intel chat. We have done 3 separate hacker history episodes about them, which I will link in the show notes. We covered NotPetya in an episode, which is their handiwork, and we also did a 2-part episode that covered their attacks on the electrical grid in Ukraine in support of Russia's military operations. These folks are highly capable, well-financed, and have a wide range of abilities that range from disrupting democracies to taking down power grids, and we're talking about them today because on April 17th, they earned the notorious accolade of graduating to a full-fledged APT and have been named by Mandiant as APT44. Does this mean they have a birthday, Matt?
You know, Chris, I have always had this thought in my head that very similar to like when bad guys get accolades and stuff, you know, cyber threat actors are probably celebrating. I'm assuming lots of vodka was consumed in some way, shape, or form. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know if it's a big enough deal. The thing is, these guys have also had a decade plus of time to celebrate this. You know what I mean? They might have had many celebrations between now and then. But, first off, as someone who's used to be in that world, huge thanks to all the folks at Mandiant who have spent just tireless years and many on the front lines tracking these threat actors and investigating these breaches, gathering these IOCs and bringing all of this together, number one. Number two, it is no easy day when you graduate to an APT. It is a massive vote of confidence from the Intel community, or a very, very big behemoth in the Intel community, that they've got the confidence that they can say this cluster or clusters of clusters, we can now call this a thing and we know what it is. But those of us on the other side of it who get to read and receive these wonderful reports, I say wonderful because they're good reads, not because they're talking about wonderful information. A huge thanks for all the work that went into that. And let's dig into it.
Yeah, I'll echo that sentiment. Thanks to the folks at Mandiant. And I will also say it's interesting you brought up the celebration thing, because we just did a special on the cyber threat from China. And Adam Cozy that was on, he was ex-CrowdStrike, not Mandiant. The other guest, Daniel Velasquez, was Mandiant. But he told me that when they were studying these Chinese threat actors, that whenever they'd kind of get published in the news or something like that, they had all these chat logs of them going out and having drinks together and stuff like that. So I think it's probably fairly common.
It's got to be, right? I mean, every time you have a win, you know, if that win is recognition or not, I don't know. Sometimes when I fear or feel that government nexus or government sponsored threat groups get identified, Chris, I feel like it could go either of 2 ways, and I won't belabor this point too much, but I feel like it could go either of 2 ways, which is congrats, right? You've been recognized. Your work is here. Your accolades are public. I could also see a really quick administrative viewpoint of you got caught.
Yeah.
And
100%.
It could really easily be like if someone didn't know at the higher level, you know, if they didn't know and they're reading this report and they're like, wait a second, I authorized this operation. And then they just, call down like, we got caught, you guys told me it was a success. And it's like, well, we stole what we needed to, or we turned off what we needed to, but we got caught. Who knows?
Yeah, I'm sure the folks behind the keyboard are celebrating, but the goal of espionage is to never let anybody know you're there, right? So
that's right.
Anyway.
Well, I don't know. We'll talk about it further, but when you have kinetic results or kinetic objectives, maybe getting caught is part of the game.
Right. Okay, so we'll start with a quote from Mandiant in the blog article they released on April 17th, and it goes, sponsored by Russian military intelligence, APT44 is a dynamic and operationally mature threat actor that is actively engaged in the full spectrum of espionage, attack, and influence operations. While most state-backed threat groups tend to specialize in a specific mission, such as collecting intelligence, sabotaging networks, or conducting information operations, APT44 stands apart in how it has honed each of these capabilities and sought to integrate them into a unified playbook over time. Each of these respective components and APT44's efforts to blend them for combined effect are foundational to Russia's guiding information confrontation concept for cyber warfare.
That's a mouthful of adjectives, huh? Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
You know, Chris, I've got a long-standing track record on the show of never really complimenting threat actors. It's hard not to read this paragraph as a compliment, and I know it's not. But what I do think is, for anyone who read that and thought, "Wow, that's a lot of foreboding words. That's a lot of formidable words. It's a lot of really heavy speak there." The goal is to understand and convey that this is a threat actor who's not, flying by the seat of their pants or just, figuring stuff out or opportunistic. The goal, the adjectives that I pick up on this are things like specific missions, collecting intelligence, sabotaging networks, information operations, honing skills into operational. It's meant to define just how refined they've gotten in this process. Mm-hmm. And if anything ever conveys just how serious someone is of an adversary, right? Listen to the adjectives. And notice there's not really any glamorizing words in this. And I feel like this is true of, probably any adversary in any capacity, right? Imagine if you're a boxer and you were coming up against someone and someone was like, "Oh, what's that?" Like, and they're like, "Oh, that guy, that's a real boxer." You'd be like, "Uh-oh." You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't take much to convey the impression of this is serious business. And I think that's what this paragraph is meant to do for anyone who read into this. Is it's meant to convey this is serious business. These guys, this is a serious threat actor. And there's a lot of notable things in recent history. We're going to talk about a few of them. There's a lot of notable things that they're known for. And if you didn't know it all tied back, get ready, because here we go.
Yeah. So with all these things, I like to go back to the beginning. And so let's do just that and run through maybe not everything we know that can be attributed to Sandworm, but sort of the highlight reel since back in 2009. So we have a pretty good idea that's when they were established. In some of the research I did, there was even a photo of a military pin attributed to Sandworm that stated 2009 as the establishing year. So I can't read Russian, so I'm just going to have to take it as what the author said it was, but it looked like a real pin to me. So from 2009 to 2013, I would almost call this their ramping up period. During this time, they were involved in espionage activities targeting NATO, Eastern European governments, and energy sector firms. These campaigns involved the use of sophisticated spear phishing emails designed to deliver run-of-the-mill malware. In 2013 and 14, we saw them create a customized version of Black Energy. This malware was initially designed for distributed denial of service attacks, but was adapted by Sandworm for espionage and destructive attacks. The group used Black Energy to target Ukrainian government institutions and critical infrastructure sectors, including energy companies, with the intention of conducting cyber espionage and pre-positioning for further attacks. Do you remember Black Energy, Matt? I think it was a pretty big deal when it popped up on the scene back in the day.
I do remember when this happened. Yeah. As you mentioned, Black Energy was originally a DDoS malware, but it was kind of adapted by them to be one for, it's funny because the line between DDoS and destructive attacks tends to really be your targets, meaning I'm going to overload a network infrastructure, or I'm going to bring down or permanently disable a network infrastructure in some cases. And I think seeing some of the kind of changes that were made, looking at the profile for Black Energy. I remember when this one came out because there were 3 versions, if I'm not mistaken. I think there was Black Energy and then V2 and then V3. And it was a modular framework. For anyone who might not be familiar with kind of modular malicious frameworks or modular malware, there's little bits and pieces that can be interchanged and kind of swapped out as needed to be. This is what allowed it to easily move from a DDoS malware to a espionage or a sabotaging one, is you could easily just swap in and out and be like, I don't really need this part right here, but I'll swap in. I don't really need too much victim profiling or maybe crypto jacking or anything like that, but I will take me some anti-tampering or some evidence clearing or something along those lines, and swapping those little bits and pieces out, especially if they're in the forms of plugins or really easy ways to do in and out over the wire, can make it a pretty extendable piece of malware. And I think that's exactly how 44 used it.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to their sophistication, because we're talking about like proper software engineering and architecture techniques, and that's the way like a sophisticated IT company would build software, let alone these threat actors, right?
I was going to say, when you start to think of plugins and you start to think of different capabilities, I mean, it's essentially, Chris, exactly what you described. It's a software suite.
Yep.
It's a software suite where you can say, disable this, disable that, enable this, and let's go off to the races, right? It's extensible for everybody. So one size fits all.
Okay, so after that sort of warming up period, they start to take things kinetic and are credited with carrying out one of the first successful attacks on an electrical grid targeting Ukraine. This attack resulted in power outages affecting approximately 230,000 residents. There's a really interesting video on YouTube that shows the plant operators helplessly watching the attackers who have control of the console. It's wild. The engineers are talking about what to do while the mouse is moving around independently on the screen, opening menus, and trying to figure out how to shut the plant down. I'll link that in the show notes for anybody that hasn't seen it. Have you seen that video, Matt?
I do. I remember when that came out. It was definitely a little while ago, Chris. It's funny to think about how long these threat actors have been active here. Yeah, I remember that one, and it is just yet another. It speaks to me, to a lot of folks, I think, and I'm going to try and consolidate my thoughts on this one. When you hear about this happening, about the mouse moving around and all this kind of stuff, either some folks think are like, oh, that's way too Hollywood to be real, right? Number one, or you think to yourself, like, how could you not know that was malicious? Like, how was that allowed to happen and stuff? You know what I mean? I'm going to tell you right now, I've investigated a scenario where a mouse was seen moving on a screen before, and it was completely benign. It was a freak accident of wires and stuff, but it's definitely one of those things where you're like, wait a second, what the heck is going on here? But then when it starts opening menus and looking for certain commands, that one speaks a little bit more to, wait a second, there might be a human or at least a machine behind this doing a little more than just scrolling around.
Yeah, and I don't think they could intervene at all. You'll see them kind of like hitting the keyboard and touching their own mouse, but they've obviously disabled the I/O controls for the actual console. And
yeah, that's right. I believe it did disable local I/O as well. So it was kind of like, not only can I not interact it, right? It's also happening in front of my eyes. I'm going to also imagine and take a shot in the dark and guess it's probably a computer you can't just go unplug.
Yeah.
When you need to. So it probably wasn't like, well, go turn it off. It's like, we can't, right? It's one of the controllers for a power plant.
So, and I think it was XP, if I remember correctly.
Of course it was. It's always XP.
It's always XP. Service Pack 2, right?
That's right. XP SP2.
So in 2016, almost a year to the date, Sandworm performed another attack on Ukraine's power grid using a new version of Black Energy called InDestroyer. This malware was specifically designed to interact with systems that control electrical substations and circuit breakers. It was one of the first pieces of malware known to be capable of directly controlling switches and breakers in a power grid. And if I remember correctly, the idea here was to rapidly switch the breakers off and on to kind of slosh the power around into big waves that would actually physically destroy vital equipment in the substation. So the TLDR on that one is it could have been much worse, but they flubbed the tactical execution a little.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this before, where sometimes adversaries are like fumbling around in the dark, like they've got access to something, but they might not know what they have access to. Let me be clear. I'm not diminishing the skills of this threat actor at all. I think this is just one of those scenarios where they did have objections and they were trying to do a thing. They just probably didn't know how to do what they were doing. The other side of it is the equipment's likely going to have some fail safes in place. I'm admittedly not an ICS expert in this one. However, I would imagine that it might be a combination of flubbing the execution, which I think is a great way to frame that one. There might have also been some security controls in place as well. The other side of it, though, Chris, is remember, some of this equipment wasn't really designed to kind of work this way. You know what I mean? Some of the equipment was not designed to take loads in this manner or whatnot. So they're definitely not only pushing the limits of maybe the equipment themselves, but also pushing the limits of kind of how the equipment was designed to be used. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but this is going to sound like a really weird example. When we were prepping for this, the only thing I could think of is like, remember that Nintendo duck game where you had to shoot the ducks in the air, right?
Yeah.
You could only pull the trigger so fast.
Right.
It could, and like, so some equipment was designed to move only so much. So you could say to yourself, like, oh, I'm going to brute force this and just blast every pixel on the screen. And it's like the equipment won't let you move that fast. I know it's a really weird example, but sometimes when I think about...
You're famous for them.
I know, right? Sometimes when I think about what can be done when it comes to kinetic attacks, translating, it's really easy for me to be like, well, I'm just going to take a Python script and I'm just going to write to do something 1,000 times over. And in theory, those 1,000 times should cause an overload or should cause a disruption or whatever it might be, right? However, in practice, hey, machine, do this thing 1,000 times over might not be as easily or physically interpreted as others think. And I'll give a really easy example, right? Let's just say you have a machine and it's got a 3-second lapse, 3 seconds of lapse between power on and power off. Okay. Your 1,000-time request is now 3 seconds off, 3 seconds on. So each cycle is 6 seconds. And I'm pulling numbers out of thin air, Chris. That's now a 6,000-second process, right? That is not I'm going to blast these things and in 5 minutes we're going to overload this. There is a time introduction there. So sometimes the theory and the execution are not always the same. And I'm shooting from the hip on some of this, but on other parts of it, I know that there's also mechanical limitations to what you can and can't do.
Yeah, and I think can be summed up in one of Maxime Lamoth-Broussard's favorite quotes, no plan survives first contact. So
that's right. That's right. We always need to go back and redo something. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth.
Yeah, I was going to say, I like Mike Tyson's version too.
Yep, exactly.
All right. So, and then of course, in 2017, the world experienced the NotPetya cyber attack. The initial deployment was done through a supply chain attack on some Ukrainian tax preparation software, but it spread rapidly and masqueraded as ransomware, but was designed to destroy systems by encrypting the master boot record and offering no way to decrypt them, even if the victims tried to pay the ransom. The malware spread far beyond the borders of Ukraine and caused at least $1 billion in damage to private companies. And yes, that is with a B. I think Merck suffered a $300 million or $400 million loss, and FedEx $300 million, like just crazy amounts of money. And again, we did a special on that one, which I've linked in the show notes. So if you want to see and go deep on how that impacts of that cyber attack took place in the real world, that's a good listen for that. And then in 2018, during the Winter Olympic Games in Pyeongchang, South Korea, they are credited with a malware attack known as Olympic Destroyer that targeted the Olympic infrastructure. This attack, which disrupted internet and broadcasting services, was initially pinned on North Korea, but further investigations suggested a false flag operation. The motivation is speculated to be the result of Russia's ban from competing in the Olympics when over 1,000 Russian athletes were involved in manipulating doping controls. Over 1,000. Matt, that's like a child getting angry and throwing a tantrum after it gets caught stealing cookies out of the cookie jar.
Yeah, no, that's definitely no one will play with me in the sandbox. So I'm going to throw sand in everyone's face. Yeah, Chris, I mean, just the things that you listed off, like this is when I talk about graduation to an APT and everyone thinks like, okay, what's involved in that process, right? I want you to look at like the 3 paragraphs, not look at, but read or listen to the 3 paragraphs that Chris just listed off here, right? NotPetya, Winter Olympic Games, Olympic Destroyer, over $1 billion in damage. Now, one of my favorite examples, and again, I use that lightly because I don't want to say it's a favorite example, but for anyone who wants to read more about NotPetya's, the wonders, just go read about Maersk shipping lines and what they went through to recover from that attack. And you will truly understand the value of redundancy after you read what their use case went through. But that attack alone, NotPetya alone shook the world. Okay. The FedEx breach shook the world. Maersk shipped the breach. I think Merck, as you mentioned, went through it as well. Each one of these was cybersecurity talk show fodder for weeks, if not months. For a while there, we didn't blame COVID for things. We blamed ransomware attacks or NotPetya for things. And it just goes to show just how big they were. Oh, and they also were the ones that hacked the Olympics in 2018. I mean, it just goes to show how prolific a group like this can be and how they can get. I know Chris has some more examples lined up here as well. But the other thing I want everyone to take away from this too, look at how they're targeting. Look at the objectives. Look at what they're achieving with these hacks, with these intrusions. It's not always the same thing. It's not always the same target. It's not always the same objective, and it's not always the same techniques, but it is always in favor of the same source. And that's another way you go about clustering and bringing together some of these threat actors, is looking at kind of that source of it. And this is where we get the originating from paragraphs and kind of bringing all those together.
And I'm just going to check myself for a second. So I said Merck, but you're saying Maersk. I'm talking about the shipping conglomerate.
Maersk. Maersk.
Okay,
Maersk. Yeah.
Maersk.
There's
Maersk.
the one. Well, however, I think there was. I don't think you're wrong, actually.
Okay. I know that it was a shipping giant that lost the $400 million. And had to rebuild all their systems because it basically bricked everything.
Well, Chris, hold on. This may have been a memory, a mnemonic slip here. Merck also had a massive NotPetya settlement as well. So, and theirs was, and I'm reading here, I just did a quick search, just in case we wanted to throw numbers out there. And I'm reading from an insurance article here, January 6th. Merck has struck up a settlement with insurers over its $1.4 billion NotPetya cyber attack claim. Now, 1.4 is not the number, but a settlement was reached with the insurers. However, Merck was also targeted. So, I mean, massive global companies. And I mean, that was, a slip up. I will say, I think NotPetya could be its own episode one of these days. I don't know. Maybe we do a 10-year anniversary or something like that in the future. Not that we'd want to celebrate that, but for anyone who's curious, right? It did target. It was a supply chain attack on Ukrainian tax preparation software. Like, I can't think of a smaller vehicle that I feel like someone drove an old like Beetle into an F1 race and won. Yep. And it was kind of like, what the heck just happened here? And it was like the right vehicle entered at the right time.
Yeah. And I don't know if I'm misremembering or not, but I do think some of the infection mechanism it was taking advantage of was similar or identical to something that was used in WannaCry. Similar.
Man, you're going to jog my memory here as well. I want to say
Google.
I want to say that they were both based on something SMB related, and I'm really gonna have to stir my memory here, but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that it was an SMB related thing. Oh no, I'm sorry, I take that back. No, WannaCry was SMB related, and NotPetya obviously was based on Ukrainian software, the tax software Medoc. In that case, right there, there might have been some of the like post exploitation stuff that was very similar.
Yeah, the internetworking transfer.
That might have been why. Stuff. Yeah, I'd have to go back and double check those. If anyone who's listening actually can remember off the top of their head how those two were related, Chris and I would love to get your feedback. Hit us up in Slack or LinkedIn for sure.
All right. So, okay, in 2020, the French military attributed a series of cyber attacks against their organizations to Sandworm. These attacks were part of a campaign that had started in 2017 and involved the use of a backdoor known as, I'm going to butcher this, XRAML. Not sure if I'm saying that right, but this was basically the next better version of InDestroyer, cross-platform backdoor with complex C2 that used a modular design, and as is part of the signature of this group, had specific capabilities for targeting critical infrastructure. And then in 2022, we see Sandworm in direct support of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where they used malware dubbed InDestroyer 2 to take out the Ukrainian power grid. A quote from the Mandiant blog: This incident was a multi-event cyber attack that leveraged a novel technique for impacting industrial control systems and operational technology. The actor first used OT-level living off the land, or LOTL techniques, to likely trip the victim's substation circuit breakers, causing an unplanned power outage that coincided with mass missile strikes on critical infrastructure across Ukraine. Sandworm later conducted a second disruptive event by deploying a new variant of Caddy Wiper in the victim's IT environment. Can you imagine that? The lights suddenly go out and then missiles start striking. I get there is a practical advantage to turning off the opposition's power in a wartime scenario, but the psychological impact of having the lights blink off and then hearing missiles start striking, I'm sure that's calculated.
there cannot be, I mean, I admit I have not been in that situation before, but I have to imagine it's probably one of the scariest situations that some of those folks have ever lived through. And it's you got to just strike the fear. And it's tough when you see cyber capabilities coupled with kinetic capabilities like that used to strike fear, influence negatively, kind of achieve your goal before you even got there. If you're striking fear before the first missile strike, you've kind of won. I'm not going to say you've won the battle, obviously, but you've already started to win a little bit of the oppressive thing that you're trying to impart on that country. And yeah, Chris, I'm with you on that one, right? Whenever we see kind of those attacks on utilities and things like that, coupled with whatever else the military is doing there, it is never a fun day.
Yeah. And it really brings home how serious this thing is that we do. It's not just about ransomware or, identity theft or business email compromise, which are all horrible in their own right. But this is like, life or death stuff. It's as serious as it gets. Yeah.
Yeah, no, this isn't, it's not, it's time to like, this is the part where you, and hopefully folks who have listened to the show will get this. This is time, when that happens, it's time where you stop glorifying the malware and, oh, look at this technique the adversaries use. And I can't believe they did this, right? None of that matters anymore. You're at a point now where you're like, okay, all gloves are off. Right? Yep. All gloves are off. Now there is absolutely no fear to combine any sort of cyber warfare with kinetic warfare or any other technique together. So all gloves are off. Let's get it. And I think it heightens the stakes as a defender, but I think it also as an offender, right, adds another thing to the arsenal. Chris, there was probably a few years, and I don't know how many years, but let's say maybe 10 or 20 years when this attack was being planned. There was no cyber military wing who was like, ooh, and at the same time, we'll turn the lights off, right? It was just, let's find an opportune time to strike. Now it's, let's create an opportune time to strike. And it's scary. It's scary stuff, especially when it becomes connected like this.
Effect,
yep.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. So as the wars continued, Sandworm, now APT44, has shifted its focus from causing disruptions to gathering intelligence. In the second year of the war, the group has changed its targets and methods, increasingly focusing on spying activities to support Russia's conventional military forces. So, for instance, one of APT44's ongoing efforts has helped Russian troops on the front lines to intercept and extract information from captured mobile devices. This helps them gather data that is useful for targeting. Over the past 2 years, APT44's role in supporting Russia's military efforts has changed significantly. This last part is fascinating to me because I think the conflict in Ukraine has really shown how warfare is changing in all sorts of ways. So from Ukraine's use of retail drones on the battlefield to the capture and exploitation of cell phones and, cyber touches all of it. It's just crazy to see how much the technology and data is a part of modern warfare now.
It does. Yeah. And I mean, when you think about collecting cell phone data to target on the front line, I mean, you're getting real time movements of where people are. And I'm envisioning in my head, like the worst things you could do here. You could start to triangulate cell signals, figure out which cell towers are the ones that are in most use, and then kind of track the masses as the triangulation
There's
moves.
probably
you
historical
can see where
GPS data too, so you'd know
exactly
where like home base was and all that stuff.
Yep, all of those. And if you catch someone, and I mean, think about the other side of it too, right? If you catch someone, and I kind of think about Hollywood scenarios where someone gets caught and they get put through this regimen of being tortured and all these things for answers and whatnot. And it might just be honestly as simple as like Face ID, opening the phone and, there's all your previous history and stuff. There's your text messages to all your friends and family, telling them where to go, where to hide out next. What's this? What's that? I mean, think about how much has changed if you can capture someone's phone and that person is an activist. Let's go a step back further and say that the military or APT44 is, observing traffic, it's sniffing messages, it's seeing all of this, how it's happening, and it's seeing it's at scale, and it's able to feed it to the military and say, hey, don't go left, go right, because that's where they are, right? Or we see the triangulation bubbles moving in this particular village and stuff like that and whatnot. And it creates a very scary element. And it's nothing to do with digital privacy and stuff. It's just sometimes sheer protocol observation. There are more pings in this town than in that town. What can we infer from that data. And it's tough. It's very difficult, Chris. And I think you pointed out, right? It's the new face of warfare. I mean, it's probably a lot older than we think it is, but here it's very public and in our face.
Yeah. All right. And so to summarize the findings from Mandiant, I'm going to read a quote from their blog article. Due to its history of aggressive use of network attack capabilities across political and military contexts, APT44 presents a persistent, high-severity threat to governments and critical infrastructure operators globally where Russian national interests intersect. The combination of APT44's high capability, risk tolerance, and far-reaching mandate to support Russia's foreign policy interests place governments, civil society, and critical infrastructure operators around the world at risk of falling into the group's sights on short notice. We also judge APT44 to present a significant proliferation risk for new cyber attack concepts and methods. Continued advancement and in the wild use of the group's disruptive and destructive capabilities has likely lowered the barrier of entry for other state and non-state actors to replicate and develop their own cyber attack programs. Russia itself is almost certainly alert to and concerned about this proliferation risk, as Mandiant has observed Russia cybersecurity entities exercise their ability to defend against categories of disruptive cyber capabilities originally used by APT44 against Ukraine. You know, I got to say that I kind of love that some of this stuff is coming back to bite them, Matt.
Chris, I had absolutely no sleep lost about threat actors getting targeted, right?
Yeah.
No, absolutely zero sleep lost when that becomes the case. Look, it's we've talked about this multiple times. It's all fun and games until you yourself get caught, or you yourself get the weapons turned on you, or the target gets placed on your back and whatnot. Admittedly, you've got a pretty extensive military and pretty large country to back you up. With certain leadership policies and things like that. But I'll just simply say and note that you're both an aggressor as well as a victim when you're a cyber attacker, you're a cyber adversary, and in this case, they're experiencing both. I hope that in the future they experience the victim a lot more than they do the aggressor.
Yeah. And I'm not trying to give any credit here, but I'd love to see what their R&D process looks like. I imagine they have quite a crazy lab going.
I would think, well, I mean, again, remember it's likely, I think you and I, we've talked about the business of malware, the business of cybercrime, the business of ransomware operations and things like that. Very similar there. Hey, this unit, you're in charge of writing malware, right? Go find me a thing that exploits Windows 10 or Windows 11 or whatever it might be. You're over there. You're in charge of building a network stack. You're in charge of C2 comms. You're in charge of this, in charge of that, right? It's pretty easy to just simply take a military unit and say, go learn C. You're going to write some malware, right? Government funded. Go learn it, figure it out, and boom, there you go. You go learn the TCP stack better than anybody else has ever learned it. Go learn it because you're going to exploit it. And really easy to do that, when you're dealing with a military unit, because they're soldiers taking orders in a lot of cases. The other side of it is, remember that they've also sometimes pulled from different pieces of malware that are out there and things like that as well. A lot of these threat actors, when something works, very similar to probably private industry too, if they find a tool that works, they stick with it until it's broken.
Yeah. Do you imagine they must contract some of this out? I imagine like certain special components and things.
I would imagine so. Yeah. I would imagine that they would have to. Some of it might be contracted out, Chris, or there might be parts of the attacker life cycle that they purchase. Mm-hmm. Like they might purchase an entry vector, a pre-established RDP session. It wouldn't surprise me if there were insiders. I don't know for sure, but it wouldn't surprise me if there were insiders at some of the locations over the years. I mean, don't forget, they've been around for, a long time, right? A long time. They've had time to build out foundational support bases. They've had time to build out networks of people, right? Let's see, we're recording this in 2024, you and I are, and they were established in 2009, right? If you had a kid the first year of Sandworm's operations in the United States, that kid is almost able to drive now. Like, that is a long time. It's a lot of life in between there. So it would not surprise me if they were able to find insiders if they were able to contract stuff out, if private companies had built businesses off of being contracted out. And then of course there's always I have some Bitcoin, I want to buy an RDP session, and we'll do everything anonymously.
Yeah, and if you remember the recent XZ compromise, these kind of nation state threat actors will plan things and slowly execute things over half a dozen years just to get that initial access or that backdoor and stuff like that.
You know, Chris, the 2018 Olympics is the one that definitely demonstrates the ability to pivot. Only because we know about the Olympics years ahead of time. It's years of infrastructure and planning to get there, right? They did not know about the doping bans years ahead of time. And I think, it's not that it was the night before when they learned about it, but it was it was relatively close. And I mean, in the grand scheme of things. And I think that just demonstrates some versatility, which just simply says, wait a second, you said anti-Russia, what? We're going over here. Right? We're focusing our targets on that for just a brief moment. Although admittedly, like Ukraine has probably carried the target or the bullseye for the longest time from this group.
100%. Yeah. So I don't know, looking forward, it's hard to say what we'll see from them. I'm sure they're going to continue to be heavily involved in the conflict in Ukraine, but I think we should expect them to pop up wherever the interests of Russia are concerned. Anything you want to add to this, Matt? Is there anything we can do to prepare or to help hurt them?
I think the last little line in the first paragraph of kind of your closing there from Mandiant's blog, if you're in, one of the sectors, or if you're in the industries or anything that APT44 might have targeted before, and you're just not sure what to do, go read a report like this. Then I'm looking through it now. There are a bunch of IOCs, YARA signatures, all sorts of things dropped in at the end of the report. Definitely go grab those. Those should be staple detections in your arsenal, whatever platform it is that you use. I assume you can make use of these things. Get those IOCs into place. Look, they might never hit. 44 might never come after you, but be vigilant and be aware. And one of the things that Mandiant calls out that I will say for any threat actor out there, they can turn on a dime. They can turn on a dime and switch their crosshairs really quickly if they need to. If you get caught up in that, you want to be prepared. So just continue to enact good security policies, best practices, things that are out there, implement detections when you can, and just be vigilant and watch out, because groups like this, they're relentless, but they're not impossible.
And I think that probably brings us to the end of this special episode. Anything we talked about in the show, if it exists in a digital format or at a website URL, will be linked in the show notes. I think there are a ton of different ways we could dive into this further, but I think there's a pretty good primer on Sandworm, which has now been dubbed APT44. So thanks again, Matt, for coming and sharing your expertise with us. I really enjoyed talking about these things with you.
As always, Chris, great to be here with you as well. Have a great week, sir, and I'm sure I'll talk to you again soon.
All right, take care.